Alright, and welcome back. This is going to be a video showing the actual process of using the Pro Seal for my fuel tanks. Just released the video kind of describing the tools and the methodology and what I'm doing with it. But I also wanted to show actual video of the process. Again, this is by viewer request. And this is all going to be in real time. I didn't speed any of this up. So I apologize, it's going to be a bit longer of a video, but it shows several points in the process of applying Pro Seal to your fuel tanks. So beginning here, you see me mixing up the Pro Seal as I described in the previous video. It's 60 to 65 strokes, a stroke being in and out, and you're rotating as you're mixing, and that's so you get a good mix of the material. And being it's a two-part, as you saw at the very beginning there, you pull the plunger out a little bit and inject some of the material, pull the plunger out a little bit further, inject more, and that way you spread the one part evenly through the other before you start mixing. Now here you see me, I'm applying Pro Seal to the back of the ribs on the stiffeners, and you want to do this for every penetration point just to make sure you have a good seal. So on these stiffeners, I had already Pro Sealed the mating surface of the stiffener to the skin, cleat-coated it in place, let it sit for a day or so, came back, applied Pro Seal to each of the rivet holes and set the rivets, and then on the back side of the rivets, what I'm doing now is applying a pretty generous amount of Pro Seal on the back of each rivet. As I've explained before, I'm doing a three-part process, as I've seen from on a vansairforce.net forums, where a builder, an experienced builder, discussed this process of kind of setting the piece in the rib or stiffener, whatever it may be, and then cleat-coating it and letting it set for a few hours or overnight to allow it to kind of get tacky, and then coming afterwards and riveting and setting all the rivets. And so that's what I'm doing here. Now this part is the fuel cap. This goes on the inner side of the skins. So you put a bead all around the mating surface of the fuel cap, and then using whatever flat tool that you've made, whether it's a popsicle stick, a tongue depressor, or in my case I cut off a plastic knife, cut it in half and made a flat surface, and you're just going to spread it out, kind of like icing on a cake. You want to make sure you spread out that Pro Seal evenly amongst the mating surface. Now the instructions will talk about on the fuel caps, you want to be careful on how you align it. There's basically the ring of the fuel cap, there's two sides of it that are a thinner piece, or that are thinner, and then the other two sides of the ring are a little bit wider, and you want to orientate that ring so that the narrow pieces, or the narrow sides or parts of that ring, are fore and aft with regards to the fuel tank, and that the wider portions are to either side of the opening for the fuel tank. And that's how you know you have it lined up correctly. So as I expressed, cleat-coating it in place and then let it set, and then that way it'll allow the Pro Seal to get tacky and really hold, and then come in and cleat-coat. And that also gives you, I think, a little more time to work with the Pro Seal to get everything set in place, instead of going back and having to rivet and put a little bit of Pro Seal. I think you actually is a little bit more efficient. Here I'm wiping up the excess Pro Seal from inside the fuel cap ring. Excuse me. You want to make sure you get all of that Pro Seal out of there, so that way the O-ring on the fuel cap isn't fouled and it has a good mating surface, so you don't have an issue of fuel leaking if you're doing inverted flight or loops or things like that. This is an acrobatic airplane, so you want to make sure that every part of this fuel tank has a good seal. So now beginning the actual process of putting the ribs in place. As I described before, I basically put everything together, dry fit everything so that the other ribs are holding the form of the fuel tank, and then I take one rib out at a time. And as you can see here, I'm applying the Pro Seal in a bead in between the tape that I have, the painter's tape, which I've discussed in previous videos. That's just to help make it not such a messy project. But you want to apply a bead both on the bottom and the top with the Pro Seal, and then you're going to come back later with the flat device, and like you did with the fuel cap, spread it out kind of like icing on a cake, just to make sure you have a good even exposure of Pro Seal to the entire mating surface on the skin and on the rib itself. And you'll do this with each rib, obviously. Now, as I explained in the previous video, you want to make sure you have a plan on how you're going to proceed with this. The plans have you, if I recall correctly, work on the inner ribs, these ones that I'm working on here, and work towards the outer rib, outer fuel tank rib next to the fuel cap, and then come back and work on the inner rib portion. So like I talked about, using your flat surface, or popsicle stick or whatever, spread out the Pro Seal along the mating surface for the rib and the skin, and then make sure it's got a good amount. You want to make sure you're not using too little Pro Seal either. Just because you're using a painter's tape doesn't mean that you want to go easy on the amount of Pro Seal that you're using either. So now, placing the rib in place, and as I discussed in the previous video, you kind of want to slide it along the skins to kind of smear some of that Pro Seal along the flanges of the rib, for lack of a better term. And then, like I talked about, go through and apply clecos to every rivet hole to make sure you set every part of that rib against the skin and have a good mating surface along the entirety of the rib. Another viewer had asked if the clecos get gunked up and what you have to do with those clecos. I've found that the Pro Seal has very little effect on the clecos, even if it's left in there for a day or two. You might want to maybe dip them in a cup of, let them soak in a cup of acetone or something, maybe overnight. But they still have full functionality. They might have some remnants of the Pro Seal, but it comes off fairly easily. So it doesn't seem to have any bad or negative effect on the clecos themselves at all. But continuing to work with the process, we'll see. And if I do find out that I have issues with them later on, they're not fitting the holes anymore, or there's too much material on them and not able to clean them up, I'll update that. But as I've seen so far, it's had little to no effect on the clecos at all themselves. So here's the process of setting the rivets. Take out a few of the clecos so that the rest of them are holding the form together and the skin doesn't pull away from the rib itself. And again, apply a little bit of Pro Seal to each of the holes, put the rivet in place, and then come back and set the rivet. Now on this piece, I'm able to use the squeezer, but obviously the rest of the ribs you'll need to use a bucking bar and your rivet gun. And with the case of the rivet gun, if you don't have the wider foot rivet head, I guess, for whatever you call the attachment, with the rubber foot or casing around it that basically helps it from walking, I would highly recommend getting those. And I think you'll probably see that in later parts of the video. If not, it's probably in some of my other videos you might have seen it. But anyway, something to help keep the rivet gun from walking as you're setting these. Especially if you're working by yourself, you have one hand holding the bucking bar on the inside, and you have the other gun with a gun trying to rivet both sides of this, and it'll have a tendency to walk if you don't have something to help prevent that. So I highly recommend that. So again, you see me here setting the rivets. I've applied Pro Seal to each of the holes, and using the Pro Seal that's on my gloves to kind of act as a sticky surface to hold the rivet in place. You stick it in and make sure you get it in there nice and snug, and then go through and in this case using the squeezer. And one thing you want to be mindful of as you're using the setter is that the rivets are going to be slippery because they have the Pro Seal in there. So just be mindful of that and be careful on how you are setting these with the squeezer. Okay, now fast forward. I've completed inserting all of the rivets in place on the outer rib. Now, as I did with the stiffeners, I'm going on the back side of each of the rivets that I just set and applying a generous amount of Pro Seal to the back side of each of these rivets. And that's just to make sure that you have a really good seal. Now, as I was doing this, about halfway through, I realized it's probably not absolutely necessary to do that on this particular rib because it's not going to have fuel on the inside of it. But I erred on the side of caution just to make sure that this penetration point doesn't allow some fuel to somehow get through between the flange and the skin and then come out the ribs. You absolutely want to make sure that you don't have any chance for leaks later on because it's a whole lot harder to fix once you've got everything in place. And then again, fast forwarding, I've now placed Pro Seal along all of the rivets on both sides, top and bottom. Now I'm going through and placing a bead along the seam of the rib and where it meets up with the flange of the rib meets up with the skin. Again, all of this just to make sure that you have absolutely no path for fuel to escape from the fuel tanks. And you'll go down one side and up the other. And then I even took and spread it basically just to make sure it got a good seal between the skin and the flange of the rib. And then also at the bottom here, at the tip of the rib, the forward end of the rib, there's a lot of openings there for how they formed the rib. So you have a lot of gaps along the forward end of the rib here. So you want to really fill in a whole bunch of Pro Seal in this area and just put a massive amount of good glob at the beginning or the tip of the rib. And I believe the instructions even talk to ensuring that you place enough material there so that it closes those gaps. And now looking on the inside of the fuel tank, this is that same rib. I'm now putting a fillet bead on the inner side of the rib, just to make sure that you get a good seal and there's no path for fuel to come through and leak out of your fuel tanks. So you apply it to both the top and bottom of the rib and just follow the line of the rib to the skin and place a good amount of Pro Seal. I think I also went after this, after I put the bead in there of Pro Seal along the seam, and then I think I took my finger and just made a nice fillet to smear basically make a fillet of the Pro Seal along like I'm doing here, just to make sure you have a good seam. And unfortunately, like I said, I end up having my back to the camera. You don't have a lot of time to work with the Pro Seal, so I didn't have a lot of time to manipulate the camera to make it easier to see what I'm doing at all points here. But I tried the best I could throughout. And then what you're seeing here is I'm working on the back side of the fuel cap. I've set the rivets already, and so now I am doing as I did with the ribs and placing a generous amount of Pro Seal to the back side of the rivets for the fuel cap, and then also running a significant amount of Pro Seal around the seam of the fuel cap to the skin, just again to make sure that there's no way for fuel to escape. And this is what it looks like after you're done. So again, those that continue to watch these videos, I appreciate it. If you get a chance, hit that subscribe button and that like button, and also that bell next to the subscribe button to get notification anytime I post a new video. As I said before, I appreciate you guys following along with me in my process here, and we'll see you next time around. I hope this video helps anyone that's working on the fuel tanks.